The morning air in Grosse Pointe didn't smell like blood. It smelled like expensive coffee and freshly cut grass. Marshall Higgins, known to everyone as Marty, stood on his porch. A mild-mannered 71-year-old grandfather with hands that looked like they only knew how to hold a hymnal or a grandchild. Then the world broke. Black SUVs roared onto the curb, tires screaming against the pavement. Men in tactical gear, weapons drawn, swarmed the lawn of the man who had been the neighborhood's moral compass for 45 years. They didn't see a deacon. They didn't see a philanthropist. They saw a predator who had outrun the clock. As the steel ratcheted shut over his thin, age-spotted wrists, Marty didn't scream. He didn't ask what was happening. He simply looked at the dirt. His neighbors watched from their windows, paralyzed. They were witnessing the death of a lie. The man who mowed their lawns and prayed for their souls was being dragged away in a storm of sirens. This wasn't a mistake. It was a reckoning for a debt that had been accruing interest since 1978. Every good deed he did was a brick in a wall built to hide a corpse. He wasn't just a killer. He was a thief of grief, watching the city mourn a woman he had broken with his own hands. Before we dive into this shocking and heartbreaking story, subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. While Marty sat in the back of that cruiser, officers were already climbing the stairs to his attic. This wasn't a dusty storage space filled with harmless memories. It was a temple of secrets. They moved past the Christmas decorations and the old photo albums of a man who pretended to be a saint. In the furthest corner, tucked behind a stack of Bibles, they found it. A small, velvet-lined box. It looked like something a man might use to store his wedding ring, or a piece of his mother's jewelry. But when the lid clicked open, the air in that room turned cold. Resting on the faded fabric was a silver brooch. A delicate piece of craftsmanship, shaped like a flower, its petals slightly bent from a struggle that happened 4 decades ago. This was Amanda Johnson's grandmother's brooch. It was the last thing she touched while fighting for her breath in the freezing Detroit mud. For 45 years, Marty Higgins didn't just keep this. He cherished it. He didn't throw it into the river or bury it in the woods. He kept it close. Every time he felt the world was forgetting Amanda, he would come up here. He would touch the cold metal and relive the moment he extinguished her light. The sheer arrogance is enough to make your blood boil. He walked among us, shaking hands with the bereaved, while the evidence of his savagery sat 10 feet above his head. He wasn't haunted by what he did. He was fueled by it. This brooch wasn't a reminder of a mistake. It was a trophy of his dominance over a family that never stopped crying for a girl who was never coming home. Look at the person sitting across from you at the coffee shop. Look at the man who holds the door open for you at church. Do you actually know them? We like to believe that evil looks like a monster in a mask, someone easy to spot and easier to avoid. But the reality is much more terrifying. The person who eventually destroys your family might be the same person who brings you a casserole when you're grieving. The problem is that our society rewards a good reputation more than it rewards the truth. We let people like Marty Higgins hide in plain sight because we are too afraid to ask what happens when the porch lights go out. We are taught to trust our neighbors. But Amanda Johnson trusted her neighbor, and it cost her everything. She stepped into a car to escape the cold, and she walked straight into a grave. How many more Amandas are out there right now, ignored by a system that is too busy to care? How many Grandpa Martys are sitting in their armchairs, watching the news and laughing because they know exactly where the bodies are buried? We are going to strip back the lies of the Motor City. We are going to show you how a man can eulogize the people he murdered, and why the system let him get away with it for a lifetime. Stick with me, because what we found in the archives of 1978 is a blueprint for how a predator survives in a dying city. The year 1978 inches Detroit was a jagged edge. The city was bleeding out, its industrial heart stuttering, and the police were drowning in a sea of violence. It was the perfect environment for a man like Marty to thrive. In a world of chaos, a good man is never a suspect. While Amanda's father, Deacon Bennett Johnson, spent 40 years standing at a bus stop waiting for a miracle, Marty was building a legacy of lies. This story is about more than a cold case. It is about the rage of a father who died without knowing the truth. It is about the failure of a police department that let evidence rot in a damp basement. Most of all, it is about the terrifying reality that the people who help us look for the missing are often the ones who made them disappear in the first place. Marty Higgins didn't just kill Amanda, he killed the peace of an entire community. He turned the neighborhood center, a place of hope and literacy, into a hunting ground. As we pull back the curtain on this 1978 tragedy, you are going to see the face of a man who felt a rush of power every time he saw a missing poster with Amanda's face on it. This is a journey through the sleet, the shadows, and the cold-blooded patience of a killer who thought he had won. He thought the clock had run out. He was wrong. The debt is due, and we are here to collect every single second of the truth. Detroit in November 1978 was not a city of lights. It was a city of iron and ash. The winter didn't just arrive that year, it lunged at the throat of the Motor City. A heavy, suffocating gray fog rolled off the river, creeping through the cracked ribs of abandoned factories and settling over the streets like a burial shroud. This was a place where the American dream was starting to rust in the rain. The assembly lines were slowing down, leaving behind a jagged landscape of unemployment and desperation. In the Cass corridor, the street lamps were more like suggestions than actual sources of light. They flickered with a dying yellow pulse, casting long, distorted shapes against the crumbling brickwork. People didn't walk these streets with their heads held high. They hurried, collars turned up against a wind that felt like a razor blade. Every corner held a shadow, and every shadow felt heavy with the weight of a city that was losing its grip on order. The air was thick with the scent of burning coal and exhaust, a metallic tang that stayed in the back of your throat. It was a time of high walls and locked doors, where the hum of the city had been replaced by a tense, vibrating silence. In the middle of this urban decay stood Amanda Johnson, 24 years old, and full of a fire that the Detroit frost couldn't touch. She was a woman who saw the beauty in the grit, who believed that a few books and a warm heart could keep the darkness at bay. She had no way of knowing that the very city she loved was preparing to swallow her whole, leaving nothing behind but the echo of her footsteps on the frozen black asphalt. Inside the community center, the heat hissed through old pipes, a sharp contrast to the biting cold waiting just beyond the glass. Amanda sat at a scarred wooden table, her eyes bright as she watched a grown man struggle to form the letters of his own name. To her, this wasn't just a literacy class. It was an act of war against the poverty and neglect trying to choke the life out of her neighbors. She spent her days in the sterile, high-tension environment of the courthouse, recording the testimonies of thieves and killers, her fingers flying across the stenograph keys to document the worst parts of humanity. These evening classes were her sanctuary, her way of balancing the scales. By 8:15 p.m., the last student had packed his bag, leaving the room smelling of damp wool and chalk dust. Arthur Penhaligon, the director of the center, watched her pull on her heavy navy blue coat. He saw the fatigue in the slump of her shoulders and offered her a ride home, his voice laced with the kind of worry that everyone in Detroit carried like a second skin. Amanda smiled, that radiant, stubborn smile that made people feel like everything might actually be okay. She told him she needed the walk. She wanted to feel the cold air, to wash away the grit of the robbery trial she had transcribed that morning. She pinned her grandmother's silver brooch to her lapel, the metal catching the light one last time. It was a small, bright point of history in a room filled with shadows. She stepped out of the heavy oak doors, the lock clicking behind her with a finality that should have been a warning. She walked into the wind, her breath blooming in white clouds, leaving the safety of the light for the hunger of the street. The wind howling through the concrete canyons of the Cass corridor had transitioned from a biting chill to a violent, freezing sleet. It turned the streets into a black mirror, reflecting the flickering neon signs of the local diners and the skeletal frames of the power lines. Amanda pulled her coat tighter, the heavy navy blue wool dampening as the ice clung to the fabric. Each step she took on the slush-covered sidewalk felt like a move through a graveyard of forgotten dreams. She reached the corner of the bus stop, standing under a sign that rattled in the gusts like a warning bell. The only other person in sight was Buckley, the newsstand vendor, a man whose face was etched with the weariness of 1,000 cold nights. He watched her stand there, a solitary figure of grace in a landscape of jagged edges. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts of white, her eyes scanning the horizon for the dull glow of the Haschenecks bus. The sleet began to coat the silver brooch on her lapel, turning the heirloom into a frozen star. There was an oppressive stillness to the air, the kind of quiet that precedes a disaster. The city seemed to hold its breath. Buckley noticed a car idling a block away, its headlights dimmed to a low, predatory amber. But in 1978 Detroit, a car in the shadows was as common as the trash blowing through the gutters. He looked down to count his change for a moment, and when he looked back up, the world felt different. The neon light above the diner groaned and went dark, plunging the corner into a thick, suffocating gloom. Amanda was still there, a silhouette against the gray, waiting for a ride that was supposed to be her salvation. The minutes stretched into a void as the sleet intensified, coating the pavement in a treacherous sheet of ice. The Haschenecks bus was 10 minutes late, a delay caused by the worsening weather and the general lethargy of a city in decline. When Leland Brooks finally pulled his heavy vehicle to the curb, the air brakes hissed like a snake in the quiet night. He wiped a patch of frost from the windshield, expecting to see the usual late-night commuter shivering under the sign. But the sidewalk was empty. There was no one waiting in the biting wind. The newsstand was shuttered. The diner was a dark cavern, and the corner was a wasteland of freezing slush and lengthening shadows. Brooks paused, his engine idling with a low, rhythmic thrum that echoed off the brick walls, waiting for a passenger who would never appear. Just 10 minutes earlier, Amanda had been a living, breathing presence, a woman with a home to reach and a father waiting for her. Now, there was only the sound of the sleet hitting the metal of the bus stop sign. She hadn't boarded the bus. She hadn't walked to the next stop. She had simply vanished into the gray hunger of the night. The bus pulled away, its taillights bleeding into the fog like two fading embers, leaving the street to the silence. Somewhere in that 10-minute gap, the trajectory of a life had been violently diverted. A predator had moved through the sleet, unseen and unheard, leaving no footprints on the frozen ground. The city didn't scream. The street lamps didn't flare in protest. The darkness just closed over the space where Amanda had stood, sealing the secret away for the next 45 years. Amanda Johnson was the kind of person who understood that every word mattered. In the high-pressure environment of the Detroit criminal courts, she sat as a silent observer to the chaos of the city. As a junior court stenographer, her life was defined by the rhythmic clicking of keys, a staccato heartbeat that transformed the messy, violent reality of the streets into a cold, permanent record. She sat inches away from the most broken individuals the city could produce, listening to the pleas of the desperate and the lies of the guilty. While others might have become hardened or cynical by the constant exposure to human failure, Amanda saw it as a heavy responsibility. She wasn't just typing. She was ensuring that the truth had a fighting chance. She took pride in the precision of her work, knowing that a single missed letter could alter the course of a trial. Her fingers moved with a grace that felt out of place in those sterile, wood-paneled rooms where the air was thick with the scent of old paper and anxiety. She saw the faces of victims who had no voice, and she vowed to be the one who captured their stories. This daily immersion in the machinery of justice gave her a unique perspective on the fragility of life. She knew how quickly a person could be reduced to a case number, and she refused to let that happen to the people she encountered. Every evening, she walked out of that courthouse carrying the weight of the city's sins, but instead of letting it crush her, she used it as fuel. She wanted to build something better than the wreckage she documented. She was a woman who lived in the gap between the law and the human heart. When the courthouse doors closed, Amanda didn't retreat to a comfortable life in the suburbs. She headed straight back into the neighborhoods that the rest of the world was trying to forget. Her work at the community center in the Cass Corridor was where her true soul lived. She taught literacy to men and women twice her age, people who had been discarded by an education system that saw them as lost causes. She understood that being unable to read was like being locked in a room with no doors, and she spent her nights handing out keys. There was a quiet intensity in the way she leaned over a desk, her patience a shield against the frustration of her students. She didn't look down on them. She saw them as survivors. She believed that if you could give a person the power of language, you gave them the power to fight back against the decay of the city. Her dedication was a rare thing in a time when most people were looking for an exit strategy from Detroit. She was a woman who stayed. She bought books with her own money and stayed late to help a struggling student understand a difficult passage. Her presence in the center was a signal that someone still cared, that the flickering street lamps didn't mean the light had gone out for good. She was the person who remembered birthdays and asked after sick relatives. In a neighborhood where trust was a currency in short supply, Amanda was a fortune. She was a constant in a world of variables, a steady hand in a city that was shaking apart. The true tragedy of Amanda's disappearance wasn't just the end of a single life. It was the abrupt termination of all the potential she carried. When she vanished, the literacy classes didn't just stop. The hope that fueled them evaporated. The students she had been guiding felt the sting of a familiar abandonment. But this time, it was worse, because they knew Amanda would never have left them by choice. The community center felt colder, the hiss of the radiator sounding more like a funeral dirge than a comfort. Her father, Deacon Bennett Johnson, saw his world shatter in a way that no prayer could mend. He had raised a woman who was the best of him, a woman who represented a future of dignity and service. To have her snatched away in a 10-minute window was an insult to everything he believed about a just and loving world. The loss vibrated through the halls of the courthouse, where the empty chair at the stenography desk became a haunting reminder of the violence they all worked to stop. Her colleagues looked at the unfinished transcripts and felt a cold dread. If someone as vibrant and careful as Amanda could be erased, then none of them were safe. The stakes for the city were suddenly much higher. Detroit didn't just lose a worker or a daughter, it lost a builder. Every person she would have taught to read, every trial she would have recorded with integrity, and every life she would have touched was now a branch of a tree that had been hacked down at the root. The silence that followed her disappearance was an active, aggressive force. It sat in the Johnson living room where the phone refused to ring. It haunted the street corner where the bus kept arriving but never found her waiting. The city was already struggling with a rising tide of crime, but the loss of Amanda felt different. It felt personal. It was a theft of the city's conscience. Without her, the Cass corridor felt a little grayer, the wind a little sharper. The people who relied on her were left to navigate the dark on their own, reminded once again that in the Motor City, even the brightest lights could be snuffed out without a word. The vacancy she left behind was a wound that refused to scab over. It was a constant, aching pressure on the heart of a community that was already carrying too much. The miracle of her life was replaced by the nightmare of her absence, leaving a hole in the fabric of the world that 45 years of waiting could never hope to fill. The next morning did not bring answers. It brought a cold, hollow dread that settled into the bones of the Johnson household. Amanda was a woman of habit, a person who understood that in a city like Detroit, reliability was a form of survival. When her alarm clock rang and the bed remained unmade, the air in the house seemed to thin. Her father, Deacon Bennett Johnson, knew the weight of every second. He didn't wait for the customary 24 hours. He didn't tell himself she stayed at a friend's house. He knew his daughter. By noon, he was standing in the lobby of the 4th Precinct, his Sunday coat buttoned to the chin, his voice a low, steady tremor as he spoke to the desk sergeant. The precinct was a hive of controlled chaos, a place where the air smelled of floor wax, burnt coffee, and the stale sweat of 100 minor tragedies. To the officers behind the glass, a missing adult was a paperwork headache, a case that usually resolved itself when the person turned up a few days later. But the deacon wasn't a man who panicked for no reason. He stood there with a fresh photograph of Amanda, her smile a painful contrast to the grime of the station. He told them about the bus stop, the sleet, and the navy blue coat. He told them she was a stenographer for the very courts they served. The indifference of the room began to shift, replaced by a cold realization. This wasn't a runaway or a woman looking for a new life. This was a void where a pillar of the community used to be. The deacon stayed in that lobby, a silent, praying sentinel, refusing to leave until someone took his fear seriously. The case landed on the desk of Detective Grant Sterling, a man whose face looked like a map of Detroit's most violent intersections. Sterling was a man of action who had spent years watching the city eat its own. But there was something about the Johnson file that made him sit upright. He knew the court stenographers. He knew the quiet, invisible workers who kept the legal system from collapsing into total anarchy. The fact that one of them had simply disappeared in the heart of the cast corridor felt like a personal insult to the badge. He didn't waste time with the usual bureaucracy. He grabbed his coat and headed out into the slush, retracing the path Amanda would have taken. He stood at that bus stop, looking at the flickering neon of the diner and the dark, empty stretches of the sidewalk. He felt the biting wind and realized how easy it was for someone to be grabbed in the silence between the streetlights. Sterling began a door-to-door sweep, his eyes sharp and his questions blunt. He pushed past the apathy of the shopkeepers and the fear of the transients, looking for any scrap of information. He was a man who understood that in a city this loud, you had to listen for the quietest sounds to find the truth. He felt the urgency in his gut, a cold pressure that told him the clock wasn't just ticking, it was running out. Every hour that passed without a sighting was an hour that the trail grew colder, and the shadows grew longer. He was determined to find her before the city's indifference buried the memory of her face. 3 days into the search, the hope that Amanda might be found safe was shattered in a trash-strewn alleyway. A patrol officer, working a lead 2 miles from the bus stop, spotted something that didn't belong among the discarded tires and rusted metal. It was Amanda's leather handbag. It sat in the mud, partially covered by a fresh dusting of snow, a refined object in a place of filth. Sterling arrived on the scene within minutes, his heart sinking as he knelt beside it. He opened the bag with hands that were steady but cold. The wallet was there, containing every cent she had earned. Her identification was untouched. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong, this was an abduction. The absence of her keys felt like a punch to the stomach, a sign that whoever took her wanted more than just her belongings. There were no signs of a struggle in the immediate area. No blood on the pavement, no shredded clothing. It was as if she had been lifted off the face of the earth. The alleyway was a dead end, a place where the city hid its refuse, and now it was a crime scene. Sterling looked around at the towering brick walls and the shuttered windows, feeling the eyes of the neighborhood watching him from the dark. He knew the narrative was changing. They weren't looking for a missing person anymore. They were looking for a predator who knew how to move through the city without leaving a trace. The weight of the bag in his hand felt like a tombstone, a heavy reminder of a life that was being stripped away piece by piece. The most devastating discovery wasn't the bag itself, but what they found a few feet away, snagged on a rusted chain-link fence. It was the silver brooch. The delicate flower of metal hung there, a tiny, glittering casualty of a violent struggle. One of the petals was bent back, the pin broken as if it had been ripped from her coat with incredible force. Sterling looked at the brooch and could almost hear the scream that the wind had swallowed on that Tuesday night. This was the piece of her grandmother that Amanda wore like armor, and seeing it discarded in the dirt felt like a violation of her very history. It was a physical link to the moment the piece was broken. The fence was old and jagged, its wire teeth holding onto the silver like a trap. There were no footprints nearby, the boots of 1,000 passers-by, and the relentless Michigan weather had trampled the ground into a messy, unreadable slurry of ice and mud. The investigation was now a race against the elements and the clock. Sterling bagged the brooch, the metal feeling like ice against his palm. He thought of the deacon waiting at the precinct and realized he had nothing to give the man but more pain. The discovery of these items confirmed his worst fears. Amanda had been here, in this dark corner of the city, and she hadn't been alone. The urgency that had fueled his first few days turned into a grim, cold determination. He wasn't just a detective anymore. He was a hunter looking for a shadow that had dared to touch the light. Detective Sterling began his hunt by looking at the men who had been kept at arm's length by Amanda's grace. First on the list was Gregory Thorne, a mechanic who spent his days covered in the oil and grease of the very cars that defined the city. Thorne was a man who didn't take no for an answer easily. He had pursued Amanda with a relentless, uncomfortable energy, cornering her after her literacy classes and offering rides she never wanted. When she politely but firmly closed the door on his advances, Thorne's admiration turned into a cold, simmering resentment. Sterling tracked him down to a garage where the air was thick with the smell of gasoline and the scream of power tools. Thorne didn't look like a man in mourning. He looked like a man who was annoyed by the intrusion. He stood there with a wrench in his hand, his eyes shifting away from Sterling's steady gaze. He claimed he was working the night shift at the Ford plant on the evening of November 14th, a claim that was backed up by a punch card and a dozen other men in coveralls. Despite the alibi, Sterling felt a knot in his stomach. He saw the way Thorne's jaw tightened when Amanda's name was mentioned. There was a lack of empathy in his voice that was chilling. He spoke of her not as a missing woman, but as a prize that had been denied to him. Sterling searched Thorne's locker and his vehicle, looking for any trace of navy blue wool or a silver pin, but the search yielded nothing but more grime. Thorne was a man with a motive rooted in rejection, but the walls of the factory had protected him that night. He was a dead end that left Sterling feeling like he was chasing a ghost in a machine. The focus then shifted to the very halls where Amanda worked. Clifton Cliff Banks was a man who moved through the courthouse like a shadow, a janitor who was always present but rarely seen. He was the man emptying the trash bins while judges handed out life sentences, a silent fixture in the background of the city's legal theater. But to the women who worked in the clerk's office, Banks was a source of constant, low-level dread. He had a habit of lingering in doorways a second too long and staring with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. Brenda Holloway, a fellow clerk, told Sterling that Banks had developed a fixation on Amanda. He would stand at the end of the long marble corridors just to watch her walk by, his eyes tracking her every movement with a cold, predatory focus. When Sterling brought him into the precinct, the air in the room seemed to thicken. Banks sat there in his stained work clothes, his fingers twitching rhythmically against his knees. He didn't have the bluster of Gregory Thorne. He had something far more unsettling, a quiet, watchful stillness. He claimed he was a simple man who kept to himself, but his history of petty theft and trespassing told a different story. He knew the layout of the city's underbelly better than anyone. He knew which doors didn't lock and which alleyways were blind spots for the patrol cars. Sterling looked at Banks and saw a man who had spent his life being invisible, a man who might have decided to finally take something for himself. The tension in the room was a living thing. But Banks held his ground, his voice a flat, emotionless drone that gave nothing away. The interrogation of Clifton Banks was a grueling exercise in patience. Sterling sat across from him for hours, the air thick with the smell of old tobacco and the hum of a reel-to-reel tape recorder. The tapes from those sessions are a haunting relic of a failing investigation. You can hear the crackle of the audio and the sharp, aggressive tone of Sterling's voice as he tries to break the man's composure. He threw photos of the snagged brooch and the navy blue coat onto the table, demanding to know how they ended up in the mud. Banks didn't flinch. He looked at the images of Amanda's life with the same indifference he might show to a pile of sweepings on a courtroom floor. Every question was met with a calculated delay, a pause that felt like Banks was testing the limits of the law. He played the part of the simple laborer perfectly, leaning into the idea that he was too unimportant to be a master of such a violent act. Sterling pushed harder, bringing up the testimonies of the other clerks, describing the way Banks had stalked the hallways. The janitor simply shrugged, his eyes never leaving Sterling's face. He claimed he was at the Motor City Lanes on the night of November 14th, throwing strikes with his friends while Amanda was disappearing into the sleet. The recording captures the sound of Sterling's fist hitting the table, a moment of pure, unadulterated frustration. He knew he was looking at a liar, but he couldn't find the crack in the armor. The tape ends with a long, hollow silence, a testament to a man who knew exactly how to hide in the open. The alibi at the Motor City Lanes was the final blow to the early momentum of the case. Sterling went to the bowling alley, a place where the crash of pins and the smell of fried food provided a noisy backdrop to the city's nightlife. He interviewed the three men who claimed to be with Banks that night. Their stories were identical, down to the smallest detail. They remembered the scores, the drinks, and the exact time they arrived and left. It was too perfect. Sterling noted in his logs that the testimonies felt like a script that had been written over a bottle of cheap whiskey in a dark bar. He knew these men. They were the kind of people who looked out for their own, especially when the police came knocking. But in the eyes of the law, three corroborating witnesses meant Banks was untouchable. There was no physical evidence to place him at the bus stop. No witnesses who saw his beat-up Chevy near the cast corridor, and no blood in his home. The investigation was hitting a brick wall made of rehearsed lies and urban indifference. Sterling felt the case slipping through his fingers, the urgency of the first week being replaced by a stagnant, heavy reality. He was looking at two men with every reason to hurt Amanda, yet both were shielded by a system that required more than just a detective's intuition. As the winter of 1978 deepened, the shadows in the garage and the courthouse grew longer, and the trail that had started at a snagged brooch began to vanish under a fresh layer of ice, leaving Sterling with nothing but a file full of suspects and a heart full of rage. By the time January 1979 rolled into Detroit, the city was no longer just cold. It was under siege. The great blizzard didn't just bring snow. It brought a paralyzing white wall that effectively deleted the landscape. Winds screamed at 70 miles per hour, whipping the fallen sleet into massive frozen waves that buried cars, houses, and the truth. For Detective Sterling, the weather was a physical enemy. Every inch of snow that piled up in the cast corridor was another layer of distance between him and Amanda. The alleyways where he had hoped to find tire tracks or a dropped clue were now deep, impassable canyons of ice. The blizzard acted as a cosmic eraser, scrubbing the earth of any biological signature that might have remained. It was a suffocating silence that settled over the precinct. The city's infrastructure buckled under the weight, shifting the focus of the police department from investigation to basic survival. Emergency calls for frozen pipes and stranded motorists pushed the disappearance of a stenographer further into the background. Sterling stood at his window, watching the flakes swirl in the predatory wind, knowing that the earth was being sealed shut. Under feet of packed snow and frozen mud, the path the killer took was being wiped clean. The environment itself had become an accomplice after the fact, providing a perfect, natural cover for a crime that was already fading from the public's fickle memory. The urgency of the search was replaced by a cold, white numbness that seemed to promise that some things were meant to stay buried forever. While the storm raged outside, a different kind of disaster was unfolding within the walls of the 4th Precinct. The navy blue wool coat, the single most important piece of physical evidence in the case, was sitting in a cardboard box in the basement evidence locker. In 1978, the storage of criminal artifacts was governed by a lack of space and a total absence of climate control. The basement was a labyrinth of leaking pipes and damp concrete, a place where the air was heavy with the smell of mildew and industrial cleaner. During the height of the freeze, a main water pipe, brittle from the extreme temperature, finally gave way. A steady, rhythmic drip of rusty water began to fall directly onto the locker, labeled Johnson. No one noticed for weeks. By the time Sterling went to retrieve the garment for a secondary inspection, the wool was a sodden, rotting mess. The water had acted as a solvent, washing away any faint traces of hair, skin, or soil that might have identified a struggle. The mold had taken root in the fibers, feasting on the organic material until the coat was a shell of its former self. It wasn't just a piece of clothing anymore, it was a ruin. The forensic integrity of the evidence had been liquidated by a burst pipe and a lack of oversight. Sterling stood in that damp basement, the smell of rot filling his lungs, and felt a wave of pure, white-hot anger. The system that was supposed to protect the memory of the dead had instead allowed it to decompose in a dark corner. The frustration was compounded by the technological limitations of the era. In 1978, the idea of using a microscopic strand of DNA to identify a killer was a fantasy. Forensic science was in its infancy, a world of blood typing that could only narrow a suspect pool to a quarter of the population and fingerprinting that required a perfect, smudge-free impression. Sterling knew that even if the coat hadn't been ruined by the water, the tools at his disposal were woefully inadequate for the task at hand. There were no high-speed databases, no national registries, and no way to track the biological signature of a predator. He was working with a kit that felt like it belonged in a previous century. He looked at the silver brooch, now cleaned of its alleyway mud, and realized that without a witness or a confession, the metal was silent. The investigators were forced to rely on shoe-leather police work, knocking on doors, shaking down informants and hoping for a lucky break that never came. The gap between the crime and the ability to solve it was a vast, dark ocean. Every lead felt like it was being filtered through a thick fog. The lack of scientific certainty gave men like Clifton Banks and Gregory Thorne a place to hide. They knew that as long as they kept their mouths shut and their alibis straight, the police were powerless. It was a time of manual filing and paper records that could be easily lost or misfiled. A period where a clever killer could simply wait for the ink to fade and the interest to die. As the thaw finally arrived in April 1979, it didn't reveal any new clues. It only confirmed the finality of the freeze. The melting snow washed the streets of Detroit clean, carrying any lingering remnants of that November night into the sewers and out toward the river. The investigation had reached a state of total stasis. The energy that had fueled the search for Amanda had curdled into a heavy, stagnant pool of defeat. The newspapers had moved on to newer, fresher tragedies, and the flyers with Amanda's face were now nothing more than pulp, peeling away from the telephone poles in soggy strips. Sterling sat at his desk, staring at a file that was becoming a graveyard of dead ends. The urgency was gone, replaced by the mechanical grind of a city that had too many bodies and not enough answers. The case was being moved from the active rotation to the back of the cabinet, a transition that felt like a second death for Amanda. The heat of the coming summer would do nothing to warm the trail. It was officially cold. The silence of the 4th Precinct was no longer a temporary state. It was a permanent condition. The folder was closed, the metal tabs bent down, and the name Amanda Johnson was added to a list of names that people only spoke in whispers. The monster had won the first round, aided by a blizzard, a leaky pipe, and the slow, grinding indifference of a world that didn't have the tools to see him for what he was. The transition from a living investigation to a cold file is a slow, agonizing death by paperwork. In 1980, the political winds in Detroit shifted, bringing in a new administration that prioritized active street warfare over the quiet, unresolved tragedies of the past. Detective Grant Sterling was reassigned to a narcotics task force, his desk cleared of the folders that had defined his last 2 years. The file labeled Johnson, A1978, was lifted from the active cabinet, its edges frayed and its contents stagnant. It was placed into a standard brown cardboard box, the kind used for industrial parts or old ledgers. A clerk with a permanent marker scrawled a reference number on the side, effectively turning Amanda's life into a sequence of digits. The box was loaded onto a pallet and transported to a long-term storage facility on the outskirts of the city. This warehouse was a graveyard of ambition, a vast, drafty space where the ceiling fans moved with a heavy, metallic groan. Thousands of boxes were stacked floor to ceiling, creating a maze of forgotten names and abandoned hopes. The air was dry and smelled of old adhesive and dust. Once a box entered this facility, it was rarely touched again. It was the place where hope went to be buried under the weight of bureaucracy. For the city, the case was over. It was a line item that had been balanced and closed. The folder was shoved into a dark corner of a high shelf, a silent witness to the passage of time. Outside, the world kept moving, but inside that box, the navy blue coat and the silver brooch sat in a permanent, airless dark, waiting for a heartbeat that felt like it would never come. While the city moved on, Deacon Bennett Johnson refused to accept the silence. For 45 years, he became a fixture of the Cass Corridor, a living monument to a loss that Detroit wanted to forget. Every Monday morning, regardless of the heat or the biting Michigan frost, he would walk to that same bus stop. He didn't come to protest or to shout. He came to wait. He would stand under the rusted sign, clutching a silver rosary until his knuckles turned white, his eyes scanning every passing face for a glimpse of the daughter he had lost. He became a ghost in his own neighborhood, a man who existed in a different timeline than everyone else. The people in the diner knew his order by heart, and the new generations of bus drivers learned to recognize the tall, stooped man who never boarded the bus. He carried a fresh photo of Amanda in his breast pocket, the edges worn soft by the thousands of times he had pulled it out to show a stranger. His presence was a quiet, persistent accusation against the precinct that had failed him. He stood there as the buildings around him were demolished and rebuilt, as the neon signs flickered out, and were replaced by digital screens. He was the only one who kept her name alive in a world that had moved on to newer, louder tragedies. His grief wasn't a loud, crashing wave. It was a steady, rhythmic tide that pulled at his heart every single day. He was a man holding a lantern in a hurricane, waiting for a light that the rest of the world believed had been extinguished forever. The years turned into decades, and the 1,970 seconds became a distant memory of grit and bell-bottoms. The city of Detroit changed its face, but the hole in the Johnson family only grew deeper. Amanda's mother passed away in the late 90s. Her final words a whispered question about where her daughter had gone. Bennett was left alone with his vigil, the weight of the mystery becoming a physical burden that bent his spine. He watched as the detectives who had originally handled the case retired and moved to Florida, their memories of the navy blue coat fading into a gray blur. He saw the neighborhood transform from a manufacturing hub to a landscape of urban ruins, then back toward a slow, stuttering rebirth. Through it all, the killer remained a ghost, a shadow that had successfully integrated into the light of a new century. The psychological weight of this period is almost impossible to measure. It is the weight of every birthday Amanda never had, every trial she never recorded, and every grandchild that was never born. The silence was a poison that leaked into the soil of the community. It taught people that justice was a luxury for those with luck on their side. For the Johnson family, time wasn't a healer. It was a thief that stole the clarity of their memories and replaced them with the dull ache of a permanent maybe. The case file in the warehouse gathered a thick skin of dust, its pages yellowing and brittle, a paper heart that had stopped beating 40 years ago. During these long, cold decades, the man who took Amanda was thriving. He wasn't hiding in a cellar or living on the fringes of society. He was breathing the same air as the people who mourned her. He was attending church, raising a family, and collecting the rewards of a life well lived. This is the ultimate cruelty of a cold case. The predator gets to age, to feel the sun on his face, and to enjoy the peace of a quiet home, all while the victims are frozen in the moment of their terror. Every year that passed without an arrest was a victory for him, a confirmation that his mask was impenetrable. He likely walked past the 4th Precinct hundreds of times, feeling the rush of power that comes from knowing something the police are desperate to find. He watched the news, saw the occasional anniversary segment about the missing stenographer, and felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of a secret kept. He was a master of the double life, a man who could pray for the sick on Sunday and remember the feeling of the silver brooch in his hand on Monday. The city's failure to catch him in 1978 had given him a lifetime of freedom, a reward for his patience and his cruelty. He believed the clock had run out. He believed that the rot in the evidence locker and the dust in the warehouse were his ultimate protectors. He didn't know that time, while a thief can also be a slow-moving flood that eventually uncovers everything. He was a man at peace, living a lie that was 45 years in the making, unaware that a new generation of hunters was rising, armed with tools he couldn't even imagine. By the year 2023, the landscape of crime-solving had undergone a radical, high-speed transformation that made the methods of the 70s look like relics from a bygone age. The gritty, smoke-filled rooms of the 4th Precinct were a distant memory, replaced by the sterile, humming atmosphere of digital labs and data centers. In this new world, the most powerful tool a detective could carry wasn't a revolver or a pair of handcuffs. It was a sequence of letters and numbers. Enter Sloan Miller, a 30-year-old forensic genealogist who lived in the space where biology meets technology. Sloan was a different kind of hunter. She didn't walk the streets or knock on doors. She navigated the vast, invisible oceans of data stored in public ancestry databases. To her, a cold case wasn't a dead end. It was a puzzle that had been waiting for the right key. She possessed a relentless focus and a deep-seated belief that every human being leaves behind a biological roadmap that time cannot erase. She was part of a new generation that viewed a decades-old crime not as a tragedy to be mourned, but as a problem to be solved with logic and precision. While the original investigators were hampered by the physical limitations of their era, Sloan was armed with the ability to look deep into the structure of life itself. She understood that while evidence can rot and memories can fade, the code of a person's identity is permanent. She wasn't looking for a man in a navy blue coat. She was looking for a pattern in the noise. Her arrival in the cold case unit marked the beginning of a digital resurrection for Amanda Johnson, a shift from the heavy, stagnant air of the warehouse to the sharp, electric clarity of a computer screen. The resurrection began with a routine integrity audit of the long-term storage facility, a massive project designed to digitize the city's mountain of paper records before they crumbled into dust. Sloan Miller was tasked with sorting through the boxes that had been sitting in the dark for over 40 years. When she pulled the container labeled Johnson A. 1978 from the high shelf, she was met with a cloud of stale air and the smell of ancient neglect. Inside, the remnants of the navy blue wool coat were a heartbreaking sight. The fabric was stiff and brittle, devastated by the water damage and the growth of mildew from the 1970 seconds. Most forensic experts would have looked at the ruined garment and seen nothing but a lost cause. But Sloan didn't see ruin. She saw potential. She knew that the very moisture that had destroyed the wool might have inadvertently sealed a microscopic secret against the fibers. She moved the coat to a specialized clean room, where the air was filtered and the light was sharp. Using a technique called vac and peak forensic, sampling a process that uses a high-powered vacuum and a specialized filter to pull particles from deep within a fabric, she began to scan the surface. She wasn't looking for hair or skin that was visible to the eye. She was looking for the invisible. She focused her attention on the inside of the collar, a place where the heavy fold of the wool had created a small, protected pocket of air. In that tiny, shielded space, her team found a single dried droplet of dark resin. It was no larger than a grain of salt, but in the world of forensic genealogy, it was a mountain of information. The discovery of that resin droplet changed the physics of the investigation. It wasn't Amanda's blood, and it wasn't a piece of the city's grime. It was a biological stain that had been shielded from the worst of the environment for nearly half a century. The lab technicians worked with a level of care that bordered on the religious, extracting the genetic material from the dried crust. They were dealing with a degraded sample, a sequence of DNA that had been battered by time and temperature. But the modern tools of 2023 were capable of amplifying even the smallest fragments. They ran the sample through a high-fidelity sequencer, watching as the computer began to stitch together a map of a human identity. For the first time since that sleet-filled night in 1978, the killer had a biological signature. It wasn't just a shadow or a name on a suspect list. It was a physical fact. This was the moment where the grit of the cast corridor was transformed into digital code. The resin had acted as a time capsule, preserving the very essence of the predator who had leaned over Amanda in that alleyway. Sloan watched the monitor as the raw data began to organize itself into centimorgans and segments. The profile wasn't a match for anyone in the National Criminal Database, which meant the killer had been careful enough to stay out of the system for his entire life. But Sloan knew that the lack of a direct match was no longer a dead end. She was about to use the killer's own family against him. The digital resurrection was no longer just a theory. It was a weapon. Sloan took the newly generated DNA profile and uploaded it to public ancestry databases, entering a world where millions of people share their genetic history in hopes of finding their roots. This was the turning point from traditional police work to investigative genetic genealogy. She wasn't searching for the killer anymore. She was searching for his relatives. The computer began to find Link's second cousins in Ohio, distant aunts in Florida, and siblings who had never even heard of Amanda Johnson. Each match was a coordinate on a map that led directly to a single family tree. Sloan spent her nights tracing the branches of that tree, moving backward through the decades with the speed of a digital hunter. She looked at census records, birth certificates, and old high school yearbooks, narrowing the search to a specific lineage that lived in Detroit during the late 70s. She looked for men of a certain age, men who were in the city during the Great Blizzard, and men who had never been on the radar of Detective Sterling. The process was cold and logical, a series of eliminations that stripped away the anonymity the killer had enjoyed for 45 years. The transition was complete. The case was no longer a box in a warehouse. It was a flashing cursor on a screen. The hunt had moved from the freezing streets of the cast corridor to the silent, high-speed servers of the modern age. The ghost that had haunted the 4th Precinct for a lifetime was finally being dragged out of the fog and into the light of a data-driven reality. The digital hunt began with a flicker of light on a screen, a distant genetic echo that bridged a 45-year gap. Sloan Miller watched as the software processed the millions of data points extracted from the resin droplet. A match appeared, but it wasn't the direct hit of a perpetrator. It was a woman named Lydia Vance Marshall, a third cousin living 3 states away, who had uploaded her DNA to find her great-grandmother. In the world of investigative genetic genealogy, Lydia was a lighthouse. She shared just enough genetic material with the unknown killer to prove they belonged to the same bloodline. This was the start of the genetic roadmap, a journey through time and biology that bypassed the ruined evidence lockers of the past. Sloan began to map out the centimorgans, calculating the distance between Lydia and the mystery man. This wasn't about fingerprints or blurry photographs anymore. It was about the inescapable architecture of a family tree. Every human being is a mosaic of their ancestors, and the killer had left a piece of that mosaic on Amanda's coat. Sloan worked with the precision of a surgeon, discarding branches of the tree that didn't fit the timeline. She moved through digital census records and digitized birth certificates, looking for a path that led back to Detroit in the late 1970 seconds. The search was silent and clinical, a sharp contrast to the screaming winds of the blizzard that had once buried the truth. The ghost was no longer a shadow in an alleyway. He was a biological certainty, a set of coordinates hidden within the DNA of a distant relative who had no idea she was helping to catch a monster. The architecture of ancestry is a complex web of connections that requires a mind capable of seeing patterns where others see chaos. Sloan spent her days immersed in the Vance Marshall lineage, building a reverse-engineered family tree that grew more detailed with every hour. She wasn't just looking for names, she was looking for locations, occupations, and movements. She traced the family's migration from the rural South to the industrial heart of the Midwest during the Great Migration. She found the point where the family settled in Michigan, their lives intertwining with the rise and fall of the auto industry. Each branch she investigated brought her closer to the center of the web. She filtered the data by age, gender, and proximity to the Cass corridor. The process was a grueling exercise in elimination. She crossed off men who were too young in 1978, and those who were serving overseas or in prison for other crimes. She was looking for a specific kind of man, one who had lived in the shadows of the Motor City, but had never been caught in its gears. The digital roadmap was becoming a tightening noose. Every digitized obituary and marriage license provided another link in the chain. She could feel the momentum shifting as the thousands of potential suspects were whittled down to a handful of names. The silence of the warehouse was replaced by the hum of the processor as the software narrowed the focus to a single branch of the Vance Marshall tree. The mystery was no longer a vast, dark ocean. It was a specific, narrowing stream that led directly to a front door in a Detroit suburb. The reverse engineering of a life is a haunting process that involves stripping away the decades to see a person as they were in a single, violent moment. Sloan began to focus on the male descendants of the Marshall line, who had lived within a 5-mile radius of the bus stop on the 14th of November, 1978. She cross-referenced old city directories with employment records from the shuttered factories. This was the intersection of physical history and digital code. She found a group of brothers, all of whom had stayed in the city during the decline. One by one, she investigated their lives, looking for a crack in the facade. She looked at old traffic tickets, civil court records, and neighborhood complaints. Most of the men led ordinary, unremarkable lives, their histories written in the mundane ink of a working-class existence. But as she moved deeper into the records of the youngest brother, the data began to vibrate with a different kind of energy. He was a man who had worked as a delivery driver, someone who knew every shortcut and every blind alley in the city. He was a man who had been present during the blizzard, his name appearing in a minor police report for a fender bender just weeks after Amanda vanished. The road map was now pointing to a single point in time and space. Sloan felt the weight of the moment as she realized she was looking at the man who had walked free while a father waited at a bus stop for 45 years. The digital hunt was nearing its end, and the ghost was about to be given a face and a history. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with a definitive, electronic click. As the software finalized the connection between the DNA from the resin and the historical records of the Marshall family, a single name appeared in bold letters on Sloan's screen: Marshall Higgins. The profile was a perfect match for the age, the location, and the timeline of the disappearance. In 1978, Higgins was 26 years old. A quiet man who lived 3 blocks from the community center, where Amanda taught her literacy classes. He was the man the original investigators had never even considered, a shadow that had moved through the city with a chilling invisibility. He hadn't been a rejected suitor or a watchful janitor. He was a stranger who had simply chosen his moment. Seeing the name on the screen felt like a physical blow to the silence of the lab. It was the end of the mystery, and the beginning of the reckoning. Marshall Higgins wasn't a legend or a monster in a story. He was a 71-year-old man living a quiet life in a brick bungalow, likely believing he had taken his secret to the grave. The digital code had done what the physical search could not. It had identified the predator. Sloane sat back in her chair, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her eyes. The roadmap was complete. Every turn, every branch, and every genetic marker had led to this name. The 45-year vigil of Deacon Johnson was about to reach its conclusion. The ghost had a name, an address, and a heartbeat. And the law was finally ready to catch up with the man who had vanished into the sleet 4 decades ago. Marshall Marty Higgins did not look like a man with a ghost in his closet. In the affluent tree-lined streets of Grosse Pointe, he was regarded as a pillar of the community, a man whose golden years were spent in the service of others. To his neighbors, he was a retired delivery driver turned devoted philanthropist, a silver-haired grandfather who spent his weekends volunteering at local food banks and organizing neighborhood watch programs. He lived in a manicured brick bungalow, where the lawn was always perfectly edged and the American flag waved proudly from the porch. There was a sickening irony in his daily routine. The man who had stolen a life dedicated to literacy and community service had spent 4 decades mimicking those very same virtues. He was a regular at the local parish, often seen helping elderly parishioners to their cars. The same hands that had once committed an act of unspeakable violence now offering a gentle, steadying grip. He had built a fortress of respectability so thick that the mere suggestion of his involvement in a cold case felt like a sacrilege to those who knew him. He was the saint of Grosse Pointe, a man who had successfully hidden his true nature behind a mask of grandfatherly kindness. He had enjoyed the weddings, the graduations, and the quiet morning coffees that Amanda Johnson was denied. As the surveillance teams moved into place, they didn't see a monster. They saw a man who had perfected the art of the lie, living a life of stolen peace built on a foundation of hidden bones. The pursuit of Marty Higgins brought the investigation to a sharp ethical crossroads, igniting a silent debate within the halls of justice. To catch a man who had successfully evaded detection for 45 years, the state had utilized the private genetic data of unsuspecting citizens. This was a new kind of surveillance, one that didn't watch a suspect's movements, but rather mapped his very bloodline through distant relatives who had never consented to a police search. Critics of the method argued that it turned every family tree into a potential witness for the prosecution, effectively ending the concept of genetic privacy. They questioned whether the pursuit of a single cold case justified the digital trespassing into the biological histories of millions. On the other side stood the heavy, undeniable weight of the victim's right to be remembered and the family's right to the truth. Does a predator lose his right to a shadow when he leaves his signature on the body of another? The officers in the surveillance van didn't have the luxury of philosophical pondering. They were focused on the reality of a killer walking free. Yet the tension remained a realization that the same tools used to find Higgins could one day be used to map the lives of the innocent. It was a trade-off between the security of the future and the ghosts of the past. As they watched Higgins through long-range lenses, the team knew they were participating in a revolution that changed the relationship between the citizen and the state forever. Justice was no longer just about what you did. It was about who you were related to. The stakeout on the quiet suburban street felt like a slow-motion collision between 2 different worlds. For 3 days, plainclothes investigators sat in an unremarkable sedan, their eyes fixed on the brick bungalow. They watched Higgins as he performed the mundane rituals of a retired life. They saw him pull a single weed from his garden, check his mailbox with practiced precision, and wave to a passing school bus. There was a chilling discipline in his movements, a lack of the nervous energy one might expect from a man whose secret was being hunted by the most advanced technology on Earth. He moved with the confidence of a man who believed he had outrun the clock. The high-tension atmosphere inside the surveillance vehicle was a sharp contrast to the peaceful exterior of the neighborhood. The detectives were waiting for a single moment of carelessness. A discarded sample that would provide the final direct link between the man in the garden and the resin on the coat. They needed his DNA without him knowing they were looking for it. Every time he stepped onto his porch, the air in the van seemed to vanish. They recorded his patterns, noted his favorite cafe, and tracked the timing of his trash disposal. It was a hunt that required a level of patience that mirrored the decades of silence they were trying to break. They were looking for a ghost who had forgotten he was haunted. A man who had integrated so thoroughly into the light that he no longer feared the dark. The breakthrough happened on a Tuesday morning, a day that felt unremarkable until it wasn't. Higgins drove his pristine sedan to a local coffee shop, a ritual he performed with mechanical regularity. He sat by the window for 20 minutes, sipping from a disposable cup while reading a newspaper, the very picture of a man at peace with the world. When he finished, he walked to a trash bin outside the shop, tossed the cup inside, and drove away without a backward glance. He had no way of knowing that within seconds, a hand in a latex glove would be reaching into that bin to retrieve the most valuable piece of evidence in 45 years. The cup was immediately sealed in a sterile bag, the saliva on the rim containing the biological map of the man who had vanished in 1978. This was the extraction, the moment where the digital theory became a physical reality. Back at the lab, the rush was on to compare this fresh sample with the profile extracted from the navy blue wool. The tension in the room was suffocating as the computer began the final alignment. When the results flashed on the screen, there was no room for doubt. It was a 1 in a billion match. The saint of Grosse Pointe was, in fact, the shadow from the Cass corridor. The coffee cup, a mundane piece of trash, had become the final nail in a coffin that had been left open for nearly half a century. The vigil of Deacon Johnson was about to end, and the knock at the door for Marshal Higgins was finally, inevitably, coming. The interrogation room felt like a capsule where time had folded in on itself. On one side of the table sat Marshal Higgins, a 71-year-old man in a sensible cardigan, who looked like he should be feeding birds in a park. On the other side stood Grant Sterling. Sterling was no longer the young, fire-breathing detective from the 4th Precinct. He was a man of 70, brought out of a quiet retirement for this one singular moment. The air between them was thick with 45 years of unsaid things. Sterling placed the old, yellowed file on the table, the one with the frayed edges and the name Amanda Johnson scrawled in faded ink. He didn't start with the DNA or the digital family trees. He started with the silence. He looked into Higgins' eyes and saw a vacuum where a soul should have been. For decades, Sterling had carried the weight of this failure, the memory of the deacon's face haunting his dreams. Now, seeing the man responsible, he realized that the saint of Grosse Pointe was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. Higgins didn't look afraid. He looked inconvenienced. His posture that of a man who believed his age would protect him from his history. Sterling leaned in, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like the very streets of Detroit. He spoke of the bus stop, the sleet, and the navy blue coat. He watched for a flicker of recognition, a twitch in the hands that had been so steady for a lifetime. This wasn't just a police interview. It was a reckoning between two men who had been tethered together by a crime for nearly half a century, one seeking peace and the other seeking a way to keep his mask from cracking. As the hours dragged on, the grandfatherly facade began to dissolve, revealing the jagged edges of a predator beneath. Higgins finally stopped talking about his charity work and his grandchildren. He leaned back, a chillingly calm expression settling over his features, and began to speak about the mask he had worn since 1978. He admitted that the good guy persona was his greatest achievement, a performance designed to mock the very people who were looking for him. He spoke about the rush of power he felt every time he helped a neighbor or shook a hand at the parish, knowing that they were touching the hands of a killer. He described his life as a series of tests, to see how much light he could stand in before someone noticed the darkness he carried. To Higgins, the decades of freedom weren't just a stroke of luck, They were proof of his superiority over a system that couldn't see past a polite smile and a clean lawn. He recounted the night of the abduction with a detached clinical precision that made the blood in the room run cold. He didn't express regret, he expressed nostalgia. He spoke of Amanda not as a person, but as a moment in time where he felt truly alive. The poison of his secret hadn't killed him. It had sustained him, fueling a sense of invisible godhood that he carried through every mundane day in Grosse Pointe. Sterling listened, his hands clenched beneath the table, realizing that the man across from him was more dangerous in his old age than he had been as a youth, because he had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of the hidden monster. The interrogation reached its darkest point when Higgins began to describe the geography of his crime. He didn't take Amanda far. He spoke of a derelict warehouse in the Cass corridor, a place that had long since been demolished to make way for a parking lot. He described the cold, damp smell of the basement and the way the floorboards groaned under the weight of his movements. It was beneath those floorboards, in a corner where the light never reached, that he had left the final remnants of his act. He spoke of the silver brooch, admitting he had felt a surge of adrenaline when it snagged on the fence, a small piece of his soul staying behind in the alleyway. He described the way he had watched the investigators from a distance, standing among the onlookers as they processed the scene. He had been there when the bag was found, standing just a few feet away, blending into the crowd of the curious and the concerned. The revelation of the warehouse floorboards was the final piece of the map. He had hidden her in the heart of the city, in a place they had walked past 1,000 times. He spoke of the silence that followed the crime as a beautiful, heavy thing that he wrapped around himself like a blanket. The floorboards were gone now, turned into dust and gravel, but the memory of them was etched into his mind with a terrifying clarity. He was a man who lived in a museum of his own cruelty, and he was finally giving Sterling the guided tour he had waited a lifetime to take. The most haunting revelation came when Higgins described the funeral. He hadn't fled the city or hidden in the shadows. He had sat in the back pew of the church, watching Deacon Bennett Johnson weep over an empty casket. He described the electricity of that moment, the intoxicating feeling of being the only person in the room who knew the truth. He had stood in line to offer his condolences, his voice steady and his eyes moist with rehearsed grief. He had looked the deacon in the eye and told him he was sorry for his loss. A lie so profound it felt like a physical weight in the sanctuary. This was the rush of power that had sustained him for 16,425 days. He enjoyed the proximity to the pain he had caused, viewing himself as the silent conductor of a grand tragic orchestra. He told Sterling that every time he saw a missing poster or a news segment, he felt a sense of accomplishment, as if he were an artist watching the world react to his masterpiece. The interrogation ended not with a whimper of a broken man, but with the cold, hard stare of a victor who had finally run out of time. He had enjoyed a full life, a long life, and a respected life, all while the man he had offered condolences to was standing at a bus stop in the rain. As the recording stopped, the silence in the room was different than it had been 45 years ago. It was no longer the silence of a mystery. It was the silence of a grave being finally, mercifully closed. The news reached the Johnson family, not as a thunderclap, but as a quiet, heavy rain that had been delayed for a lifetime. When the phone rang in the house where the silence of 1978 had never truly left, there were no cheers of victory. Deacon Bennett Johnson, now a man of 90, received the word with a stillness that only those who have lived in the desert of maybe can understand. The name Marshall Higgins meant nothing to him, yet it meant everything. It was the answer to the prayer he had whispered into the Michigan wind for 16,425 mornings. The vigil at the bus stop was finally over. The tall, stooped man would no longer be a fixture of the Cass corridor, a ghost waiting for a ghost. The resolution brought a strange, hollow peace to the family home. There was a sense that the air had finally cleared, but the oxygen felt thin. For 45 years, their lives had been organized around a void, a missing center that defined every holiday and every quiet Sunday. Now that the void had been filled with a name and a face, they were left to navigate a world where the search was no longer necessary. The deacon sat in his chair, his hands finally resting still on his knees, looking at the photo of Amanda on the mantel. She was still 21, frozen in a smile that would never age, while the man who took her had been allowed to grow old. Justice had arrived, but it felt like a guest who had shown up long after the party had ended. The bitterness of the reality lay in the math of stolen time. As Marshall Higgins was led into the courthouse, the same building where Amanda had once dutifully recorded the words of the law, the city saw the true cost of the delay. Higgins had enjoyed a full span of human experience. He had seen the turn of the century, felt the joy of his children's successes, and lived in the comfort of a quiet neighborhood. Meanwhile, the Johnson family had been trapped in a state of suspended animation. Justice in the Motor City was not a restoration. It was a cold accounting of what could never be returned. The trial was a brief affair, the DNA evidence acting as a silent, indisputable witness that no amount of grandfatherly charm could overcome. There was a collective intake of breath when the saint of Grosse Pointe was finally stripped of his mask. The public struggled to reconcile the image of the helpful volunteer with the predator who had snagged a silver brooch on a fence in the dark. It served as a haunting reminder that evil does not always wear a snarl. Sometimes it wears a cardigan and a smile. The stolen years were a debt that the legal system had no currency to pay. As the judge handed down the sentence, the room felt less like a place of triumph and more like a tomb being sealed. The weight of those 4 decades sat heavy on everyone in the gallery, a reminder that while the law may eventually catch up, it can never outrun the damage done to the soul. In the quiet offices of the cold case unit, the physical manifestation of the mystery was finally put to rest. The folder labeled Cold Case 17 was pulled from the active stack one last time. Sloan Miller and the retired Grant Sterling stood together as the final entries were made. The yellowed pages, the blurry 1,978 crime scene photos, and the reports of failed leads were all summarized in a final digital postscript. The box that had sat in the damp warehouse for nearly half a century was marked closed. It was a moment of profound professional closure, yet the air remained heavy. This case would become a textbook example of the power of the digital resurrection, a beacon of hope for thousands of other families still waiting in the dark. It proved that in the modern age, there is no such thing as a perfect disappearance, only a delay in the discovery. The legacy of Amanda Johnson was no longer just a story of a tragic loss. It was a testament to the persistence of those who refused to let the past stay buried. The technology had bridged the gap, but it was the human will, the deacon's prayers, and Sterling's lingering guilt that had kept the light from going out completely. The file was moved to the archives, but this time it wasn't a burial. It was a record of a truth that had finally fought its way to the surface. The city of Detroit, scarred and changing, had managed to settle one of its oldest debts, proving that even after 45 years, the record still mattered. The final lesson of Amanda Johnson's story is a chilling one that lingers long after the sirens have faded and the courtroom doors have locked. It is the realization that the people we think we know, the neighbors who wave, the volunteers who serve, the grandfathers who cherish their families, can carry a darkness that defies description. Marshall Higgins proved that a monster can live a good life, and that a mask of respectability is the most effective shield ever devised. As the sun sets over the Detroit skyline, the Cass corridor remains a place of long shadows and flickering lights, but one specific shadow has finally been cast out. The deacon eventually returned to the bus stop one last time, not to wait, but to say goodbye. He left a single rose near the rusted sign, a splash of color against the gray concrete. He walked away with the slow, measured pace of a man who had finally finished a marathon. The case of the missing stenographer was no longer a mystery to be solved, but a history to be remembered. The city keeps moving, its gears grinding toward a future that Amanda never got to see, yet her presence is felt in every successful search for the truth. The long silence has been broken, and the predator's peace has been shattered by a single droplet of resin and a father's refusal to forget. The story ends where it began, in the quiet spaces between the streetlights, with a final haunting realization. The truth doesn't care how much time has passed. It only waits for someone with the light to find it.